For 30 years, Jesus disappears. No miracles, no sermons, no crowd, no title, no followers, just a man in a small town working with his hands, and nobody outside that town knowing his name. Then, in 3 years, everything changes. Most people ask how he died. That is not the real question. The real question is why he lived so little, and why those 30 missing years were never actually missing at all. There is a word buried in the Greek of Luke's gospel, attached to the exact moment Jesus stepped into public view. A word almost every translation quietly softens. It has nothing to do with counting years. It has to do with something being ready. And once you see what that word actually says, the whole question changes shape. By the end of this, you will understand not just why a man died at 33, but why 30 years of silence were the foundation under everything that came after, and why that has something to say to anyone listening right now who feels like their own life hasn't started yet. Let's start from the beginning. Picture the moment. Not the version painted in gold and soft light, with clean robes and peaceful faces. The real one, Judea, around the year 30. Sun that flattens the ground into dust, dust that gets into skin, into fabric, into lungs. Noise that doesn't resolve into anything. Shouting, weeping, wood striking stone. A crowd that can't decide if it's watching an execution or something it doesn't have a name for yet. On a hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull, 3 men hang, nailed to wooden beams. One of them is 33 years old. Stay on that number for a second. Don't let it slide past. 33. Today, a lot of people that age are still finishing school, still hunting for a first real job, still figuring out who they are. And in that same short span, a man born in a town people mocked just for naming it. No army, no fortune, no throne, none of the machinery the world associates with power, permanently altered the direction of human history. Why did he live so little? Bad luck? A political calculation? A plan that had to unfold exactly the way it did? To answer that, we have to understand the world he was born into, because it wasn't the quiet pastoral scene so many paintings suggest. It was a world under pressure, a world run equally by force and by fear. First century Palestine was not peaceful ground. It was an occupied province of Rome, held together by a mix of calculated violence and calculated tolerance. Rome didn't erase the cultures it swallowed. It absorbed them, managed them, kept them functional inside the machine. Gods, temples, customs, languages, all allowed up to a point. But cross the line of Roman authority, and the empire made an example of you publicly, so no one else would try. And of every province Rome held, Judea was among the hardest to manage, because the Jewish people weren't just another conquered population. They carried a long memory, a religious identity that ran bone deep, and a promise that had been waiting centuries to be fulfilled. A Messiah. In Hebrew, Mashiach. In Greek, Christos. Both mean the same thing, the anointed one, the chosen one, the figure the old prophets said would come to free Israel, restore David's throne, open a new chapter for the whole human story. Some pictured a warrior king, unbeatable in battle. Others, a purified high priest. Still others imagined something stranger, a spiritual figure who would remake not just Israel, but the entire world from the inside. Into that pressure, that mix of hope and threat, Jesus was born. Likely in Bethlehem, though his family belonged to Nazareth. Likely a few years before what we now call year 1, thanks to a small miscalculation, a 6th century monk made when he set our calendar. So the man whose birth splits history into before and after was technically born a few years before himself. Nazareth sat in Galilee, And Galilee had a bad name among the religious South: rural, ethnically mixed, touched by Greek influence, with none of Jerusalem's prestige. In John's Gospel, one of the first people to hear about Jesus asks a question that says everything. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? That line isn't a throwaway detail. It's the sound of the capital's contempt for everything that came from the north. Joseph, his adoptive father, was what the Greek text calls a tekton, usually translated carpenter, though the word likely meant something broader: building in stone and wood, repairing structures in a region still under construction. Not wealthy, not destitute either. A working craftsman in a rural economy. Steady physical labor, modest resources, a life built around a small community rather than above it. That kind of ordinary working class start echoes something older than Jesus himself. Centuries earlier, the prophet who wrote of a coming servant of God didn't picture him arriving in splendor. He wrote of someone with no beauty that would draw a crowd, someone people would overlook, a man of sorrows who grew up like a root out of dry ground. Not a king striding into a palace, but a nobody rising out of poor soil. Now, William Barclay, one of the 20th century's most respected commentators on the Gospels, points out something that rarely makes it into a Sunday sermon. This was a family carrying real financial strain. When Mary brought her purification offering to the temple after the birth, she didn't bring the standard lamb. She brought 2 turtle doves, the alternative the law made for people who couldn't afford the full offering. Jesus wasn't born into comfort. He was born into the plain insecurity of people who work with their hands and know that what comes in doesn't always cover what has to go out. That detail isn't decoration. It matters because when this same man later spoke about the poor, the overlooked, the people everyone else dismissed, he wasn't repeating a philosophy he'd read somewhere. He was speaking from inside a life he had actually lived in his own body. And in that rooted, modest life, nothing spectacular, nothing that made the history books, Jesus grew up. Here is where Matthew's gospel does something strange, and almost nobody stops to notice it. Chapter 2 ends with Jesus still a boy. Chapter 3 opens with a man of 30 standing at the edge of a river. Between those 2 chapters sits a gap, 30 years, and not one verse to fill it. No miracle, no parable, no recorded word. The Savior of the world spent 10 of the 11 parts of his entire life doing nothing anyone thought was worth writing down. What was he doing during all that silence? He was growing up in an ordinary household, learning a trade, showing up for work. Tradition holds that Joseph died sometime before Jesus began his public ministry. He's absent from the wedding at Cana, though Mary is there, which likely means the household's oldest son had to become its provider. Not a symbolic role, a literal one. The man supporting his mother and his younger siblings, cutting wood, fitting joints, repairing what needed repairing in the same small town for years, while the rest of the world had no idea he existed. Stop and sit with that for a moment, Bob, because it isn't a footnote before the real story starts. It is the story. He didn't arrive ready-made. He was built quietly in a room nobody was watching. The tension we're carrying forward is this. Somewhere in those 30 years, something shifted. Something in that workshop, in that town, in that waiting, prepared a man to walk out and change the direction of history in only 3. What was it? And what does it cost to wait that long before anyone sees what you're capable of? To understand what happened in that shift, we have to go back to what the world outside Nazareth actually looked like. Because it wasn't gentle. And the man who eventually walked into it wasn't naive about what he was walking into. Rome ruled through a chain of local power, and in Judea, that chain ran through men who had learned to survive by staying useful to the empire. The high priesthood, meant in the old law to be a sacred office held for life, had become something closer to a political appointment, handed out and withdrawn at the will of Roman-approved governors. The men who held it depended on Rome to keep their position, and Rome depended on them to keep the peace. It was a fragile, mutually dependent arrangement, and both sides knew that any disruption, a riot, a rebellion, a crowd rallying behind the wrong figure at the wrong moment, could bring the whole thing down on everyone's head. Herod's family had ruled or half ruled the region for generations by playing exactly that game, building, taxing, appeasing Rome, crushing dissent quickly and visibly whenever it appeared. Historian Josephus, writing decades later as a Jewish general turned Roman chronicler, describes a land stitched together out of client kings, fortified cities, and constant, simmering unrest, a region that could look calm on the surface while several different factions underneath were already choosing sides for the war that would eventually come. Into that fragile arrangement stepped the Roman governors, men whose entire job was to keep Judea quiet enough that Rome didn't have to think about it. Pontius Pilate held that post during the years that matter to this story. A man remembered in the ancient accounts that survive him as someone who ruled with more force than patience, who had already clashed publicly with the Jewish population more than once before Jesus ever stood in front of him. This was the machine Jesus was born under and grew up inside, not a background detail, the actual physics of the world that would eventually kill him. Every year, that machine strained hardest during 1 week, Passover. Barclay notes that a Roman census taken 30 years after the crucifixion counted the lambs sacrificed in Jerusalem for the festival, close to 250,000 of them. Since religious law required a minimum group of 10 people per lamb, that number points to something staggering, something over 2 million pilgrims converging on one city for 1 week every single year. Any adult male living within about 30 kilometers of Jerusalem was required by law to attend. Crowds that size, fueled by centuries of messianic hope, were exactly the kind of thing Rome feared most, and exactly the kind of thing the high priesthood had to manage without letting it tip into open revolt. That is the room Jesus eventually walked into. Not a quiet religious debate happening at the edges of history, a powder keg that both Rome and the temple leadership had spent decades learning to keep from exploding, and a man about to say things in public in front of those crowds that neither side could afford to ignore. But none of that happened yet. Not in Nazareth. In Nazareth, there was only a workshop, a widowed mother, younger brothers and sisters to feed, and years that repeated themselves without incident. Barclay makes an observation here worth sitting with. During those 30 years, Jesus knew at some point, in some way, that the world was waiting for him, even while the world had no idea it was waiting. Barclay compares it to timing a decisive strike, knowing the target is real, knowing the moment matters, and still having the discipline to wait for the right one instead of rushing early. Jesus, by that reading, spent years sensing that something was coming, growing more aware of it with each season without ever forcing the clock forward. And then, one day, it moved. A cousin of his, a wild, unpolished man named John, who lived on locusts and wild honey and preached repentance out in the desert wilderness by the Jordan River, began drawing enormous crowds. People streamed out from Jerusalem and the surrounding towns to hear him, to be baptized in the river as a sign of turning their lives around. And somewhere in that crowd, one day, a 30-year-old carpenter from Nazareth walked down into the water alongside everyone else. This is where the word hides. Luke's gospel records the moment like this. Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years old. In the Greek text, the word rendered began is archomenos, a form of the verb archo, to begin, used here almost like a title, a marker. Most translations quietly attach that word to his age, as if Luke were simply noting a birthday. He was about 30 when he began. But in the structure of the Greek sentence, the word carries more weight than that. It isn't primarily marking a number. It's marking a threshold. The instant something that had been building in private finally became public. Not, he happened to be 30. Closer to, this was the beginning. Full stop. With the age offered almost as an afterthought, a note for the record, not the point of the sentence. That distinction matters more than it looks like it should. Because if the emphasis is on the age, then the 30 years before it read as a countdown, empty time the story had to get through before the plot could start. But if the emphasis is on the beginning, then those 30 years aren't a countdown at all. They're the runway, not absence, preparation. Every quiet year in that workshop, every joint he cut, every debt he covered for his mother, every ordinary, unremarkable day, all of it wasn't Jesus waiting to become who he was. It was Jesus becoming who he was in a room nobody thought to watch. That single word reframes everything that follows. But it also opens a harder question, one this story can't move past without facing directly. If 30 years of obscurity were the foundation, what was actually being built down there, out of sight? What happens in a person during the years nobody is watching? And is it possible that the years you're living right now, the ones that feel like they don't count, the ones with no audience and no applause, are doing something in you that you won't be able to see until much later? Let's go deeper into what that beginning actually looked like, because the days that followed the river moved fast, and every one of them carried weight. After the baptism, before a single sermon, before a single miracle, Jesus went alone into the wilderness for 40 days. The Gospels describe temptation there, not abstract, philosophical temptation, but something aimed directly at the specific pressures of the mission ahead. Turn stone into bread and solve hunger by force rather than trust. Throw yourself from the temple and let spectacle prove what patient obedience was meant to prove instead. Bow down and take the kingdoms of the world the easy way, skipping the cross entirely. Each temptation offered a shortcut around exactly the kind of long, unglamorous preparation those 30 years represented. And each time, Jesus refused the shortcut. That refusal matters because it's the same pattern that shaped the 30 years in Nazareth, now compressed into 40 days in the desert. The pattern is consistency, doing the harder, slower, less visible thing again and again, long before anyone is applauding for it. From there, the public ministry began, and it began almost immediately by gathering people. Fishermen mending nets on the shore of a lake, a tax collector sitting at his booth, a man his own countrymen despised for working for Rome. Ordinary people, none of them powerful, none of them impressive by any standard the world used to measure importance. Barclay describes it well. A Galilean carpenter, penniless, homeless, in the sense of having no fixed base, with 12 unremarkable men beside him, while the religious establishment of his own people was already quietly working out how to remove him as a dangerous threat to their carefully balanced order. That contrast is the entire shape of the next 3 years. On one side, crowds growing by the week, drawn by teaching that didn't sound like anything the religious professionals were producing, and by acts that people were calling miracles: healing, feeding, restoring. On the other side, a growing unease among the people whose entire position depended on nothing changing. This tension wasn't new. It was old as the prophets who came before him. Isaiah, writing roughly 7 centuries earlier, described a figure the Hebrew text calls God's anointed servant, someone who would come gently, without the trappings that usually announce a king, and who would ultimately be despised and rejected rather than celebrated. Isaiah also uses the language of anointing, the same root behind the word Messiah, to describe someone chosen and marked out for a purpose no one around him fully understood yet. The pattern was already written: a chosen figure, arriving without spectacle, doing something that the powerful around him would eventually find impossible to tolerate. And that is exactly the pattern that started closing in around Jesus as his public ministry gathered momentum. He healed on the Sabbath, which broke religious convention. He ate with tax collectors and people the religious establishment considered unclean, which broke social convention. He spoke about God's kingdom in terms that sounded less like reform and more like an entirely new order, one where the last were first, where the poor were blessed, where the religious insiders were warned they might find themselves outside looking in. None of it was random provocation. Each piece of it was aimed carefully at exactly the structures that depended on things staying the way they were. But it wasn't only confrontation. There was warmth in it too, an almost scandalous generosity. He told a story about a father who ran, undignified, to meet a son who had wasted everything and expected nothing but rejection. He told another about a shepherd who left 99 sheep safe in the fold to go chasing after the one that wandered off, as if the one mattered as much as the 99 together. People who had spent their whole lives being told they were outside the circle of God's attention were suddenly hearing that they were the whole point of the story. That kind of grace drew crowds that no amount of religious authority could easily compete with, which is exactly why the pressure kept building. Every week the crowds grew. The calculation facing the religious leadership grew more urgent. Barclay describes the same collision from another angle: a construction worker's son from a scorned province of the empire, teaching with an authority nobody had ever taught with before, standing in a land dense with pagan temples, Greek philosophy, and Roman monuments to Caesar's divinity, and asking, in that setting of all settings, "Who do you say that I am?" and waiting for the answer he already knew was coming. Somewhere in that swelling crowd and swelling unease the machine described earlier, the high priesthood needing calm, Rome needing order, especially at Passover, started turning toward its inevitable next move. Here's where the story stops being distant history and starts pressing closer. Because everything building toward the cross, the crowds, the threat to power, the collision between grace and control, didn't happen to a stranger. It happened to a man who had spent 30 years learning patience in a room nobody was watching, and then spent 3 years refusing to let that patience turn into fear when the whole machine of empire and religion turned against him. Which raises the question underneath this entire story. When your own moment of pressure comes, when doing the right thing costs you something real, will the years you spent quietly becoming who you are hold up under that weight or crack? Let's walk into the last week, because this is where all four threads, the historical, the theological, the symbolic, and the personal, start to braid together. Jesus entered Jerusalem for what would be his final Passover riding on a young donkey, not a war horse, a detail the crowds understood instantly because it echoed an old prophecy about a king who comes in peace rather than conquest. They laid branches in his path and shouted words of praise usually reserved for a liberating king. For one afternoon, the pressure that had been building for 3 years looked like it might resolve in triumph. It didn't. Within days, one of his own closest followers agreed to hand him over for a set price. 30 pieces of silver, the exact compensation Old Testament law assigned for the loss of a slave, a detail that later readers would find impossible to read as coincidence. He shared a final meal with his 12 closest companions, told them plainly that one of them would betray him and that all of them would eventually abandon him, and then went out to a garden called Gethsemane to pray, alone, in the dark, in what the Gospels describe as anguish severe enough that his sweat fell like drops of blood. That detail deserves a pause. This wasn't a man moving serenely toward an outcome he had already made peace with from the start. This was a man in genuine agony, asking if there were any other way to be spared what was coming. And then, after that plea, choosing to go through with it anyway. The 30 years of quiet obedience and the 40 days of desert refusal converge here, in a garden, in the dark, in the hardest possible version of the same decision he had already been making his entire life. Not the easier path, the harder, truer one. He was arrested that night, betrayed with a kiss, an act of affection turned into a signal for soldiers, taken before the religious council in a hearing that violated several of the legal protections Jewish law was supposed to guarantee even the accused, handed over the next morning to Pontius Pilate, the one man in the province with the legal authority to execute a Roman sentence of death. Pilate, according to the gospel accounts, found no real charge against him and tried more than once to release him. But the machine described earlier, Rome's need for order at Passover, the high priesthood's need to protect a fragile balance, closed around the moment and left him almost no room to move. A crowd, worked into a frenzy by voices in the religious establishment, called for crucifixion. Pilate, according to the account, physically washed his hands in front of them, a symbolic gesture of refusing responsibility that didn't actually remove any of it. What followed was brutal by design. Roman flogging before crucifixion was calibrated cruelty, severe enough to weaken a man past resistance, public enough to terrify anyone watching into compliance. Jesus was beaten, mocked, dressed in a purple robe, and a crown twisted from thorns as a cruel joke about the king the crowd had just rejected, and then made to carry the crossbeam of his own execution through the streets, until, the Gospels note, he could no longer carry it, and a bystander was pulled from the crowd to finish the task for him. At Golgotha, they nailed him to the wood, between two convicted criminals. Above his head, on Pilate's own order, a sign in 3 languages announced the charge, King of the Jews, likely meant as one more piece of mockery, aimed as much at the religious leaders who had pushed for his death as at the man dying under it. He hung there roughly 6 hours before he died, a death that came so much faster than expected that Mark's gospel says Pilate was genuinely surprised when told it had already happened. The most likely medical explanation is that the flogging beforehand had already brought him to the edge of death before the crucifixion even began. One further detail deserves mention. John's gospel records that a Roman soldier, confirming death before the body could be released, drove a spear into his side, and that what came out was described as blood and water, a detail some modern physicians have connected to fluid buildup around the heart under extreme trauma. It proves nothing on its own, but it is one of those places where an ancient text and modern medical knowledge sit close enough together to be hard to dismiss entirely. 7 centuries before any of this happened, Isaiah had already written of a servant who would be pierced, crushed, led like a lamb to slaughter, and buried strangely among both the wicked and the rich. Words that read against this scene feel less like poetry and more like a photograph developed centuries before the picture was taken. Jesus died that Friday and was buried the same day, since Jewish law forbade leaving a body exposed overnight, especially during Passover. The tomb belonged to a man named Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the ruling council who the Gospels describe as a secret follower, someone who had kept his loyalty quiet until the moment it no longer mattered whether anyone found out. A heavy stone sealed the entrance, and 3 days later, on Sunday morning, that tomb was empty. That emptiness is the hinge the entire story turns on, the point where history and faith either separate or meet, depending on what you believe walked out of that tomb. It is the claim that took a group of frightened, scattered followers, hiding behind locked doors, and turned them within weeks into a movement that no empire, no persecution, and no century since has managed to extinguish. We've walked through the machinery, the betrayal, the trial, the cross, and the empty tomb, the raw historical shape of why this man died at 33. But history alone doesn't answer the deeper question this whole story keeps circling back to. So let's return to it directly, because it's the same question we opened with, and by now it should feel heavier than it did at the start. Why only 33 years? There are at least 4 honest ways to answer that. Each one reveals something different, not just about Jesus, but about how we think about time, meaning, and our own lives. The first answer is historical, and it's blunt. Jesus died young because he had become politically inconvenient to too many people holding too much power. The high priesthood needed him gone to protect a balance decades in the making. Rome needed him gone to guarantee order during the most volatile week of its calendar. From this angle, his death isn't a theological riddle at all. It's the entirely predictable outcome of challenging entrenched power without an army, without wealth, with nothing but a moral clarity sharp enough to make the powerful see themselves clearly for the first time. Prophets tend to die young under empires. That's not coincidence. It's simply what power does when it meets something it cannot buy, bribe, or tame. The second answer is theological, and it points in almost the opposite direction. Across nearly every Christian tradition, from Rome to Constantinople, from the Reformation to the evangelical churches of modern Lagos or Sao Paulo, his death was never framed as an accident or a defeat. It was described as the center of a plan that existed before creation itself. On this account, God didn't become human to live a long, comfortable life and die quietly of old age in Nazareth. He became human to enter human suffering and death from the inside and transform them from within. To be, as the gospel writers put it, the Passover lamb, killed at the exact moment the festival itself was being celebrated all around him. Under this lens, asking why he lived so little is a little like asking why a single grain of wheat has to die in the ground before it can produce anything at all. Death here isn't the end of the plan. It's the center of it. The third answer is symbolic, fascinating, though it deserves to be handled carefully. The number 33 carries an unusual density of meaning across the biblical tradition. 3, on its own, shows up again and again attached to divine completeness. 3 days in the tomb, 3 years of public ministry, 3 denials from Peter before the rooster crowed. 33 amplifies that pattern. There are, for what it's worth, 33 vertebrae in the human spine, something some traditions have read as the body's own axis between earth and heaven. Coincidence? Or the kind of pattern the human mind notices because the pattern is genuinely there? There's no tidy answer, But the sheer symbolic weight the number carries wrapped around this particular life is at least worth pausing over. And the fourth answer is the least expected, and maybe the most powerful. Maybe the right question was never why did he live so little? Maybe the right question is, what did he do with what he had? 33 years. No internet, no printing press, no army, no fortune, none of the tools the modern world associates with lasting influence. Born in a forgotten corner of an empire that no longer exists, speaking a dialect of Aramaic almost nobody on earth still speaks. And yet today, roughly 2.4 billion people identify as Christian, nearly 1 in 3 human beings alive. The calendar most of the world uses splits time into before him and after him. The modern idea of universal human dignity, foundational to the UN's own Declaration of Human Rights, traces its roots directly or indirectly back to a message a carpenter from Nazareth preached over the course of 3 years. Organized hospitals, caring for the sick regardless of wealth or class, trace their origin to Christian institutions. The medieval universities that gave rise to the modern university were born inside the church. Western music, from Bach to a modern stadium full of voices, draws one of its deepest rivers from Christian worship. No philosopher, no king, no conqueror, no scientist has produced an impact this massive and this durable in proportion to the actual visible span of their life. 33 years, which is also quite possibly the exact age some of you listening right now are living through, or recently lived through, or are about to. And maybe that is the quietest, most piercing invitation buried in this entire story. Not necessarily an invitation to accept every claim any tradition makes about who this man was, but an honest invitation to ask yourself something simpler. What am I doing with my time? What is actually being planted right now in the silence of my own ordinary years, the years nobody else is watching, in whatever workshop your own daily life happens to be built inside? So, why did Jesus live only 33 years? Because the world he lived in was brutal, and the people holding power feared what he represented with a clarity we rarely see this plainly in our own time. Because from the standpoint of faith, it had to be this way. The grain of wheat that never dies in the ground never produces anything at all, because the 30 quiet years before those 3 years of fire weren't wasted time. They were the invisible workshop where everything that came after was actually built. And because maybe the real measure of a life was never how long it lasted, maybe it's what's still standing after the years run out. The story of Jesus, as the Gospels tell it, is the story of someone who found the courage to speak truth to power and paid for it with his life. A man with no power, no money, no army, from a people the empire looked down on, who in 3 years of public work planted something that 2,000 years of persecution, war, division, and institutional failure still haven't managed to kill. None of that needs a miracle to be remarkable. Although, for billions of people around the world, the miracles are precisely what makes the rest of it make sense. The story keeps going. Every generation rereads it with new eyes, new questions, new wounds, and new hope. This retelling was ours today. If something in this story moves something in you, if it left you holding a question you didn't have an hour ago, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your country, wherever you happen to be right now. Something about knowing that people under completely different skies, all over the world, sit down together to hear the same old story still means something to me. It's proof that some things really haven't changed in 2,000 years. And if you're not part of this community yet, now's a good moment to be, because the next story we're getting ready to tell is older, stranger, and connected to this one in a way almost nobody has noticed yet. Until next time.